Okay. Okay. Hi, welcome everybody. I'm so glad that you're all panelists and journalists alike are able to join this media briefing around the Food System Summit. My name is Katie Taft. I lead the communications for the Food System Summit. Unfortunately, the deputy to the special envoy who was supposed to be moderating, Dr. Martin Frick, had a personal urgent affair to attend to, so you are stuck with me. So I'm sorry about that, but I hope we can get through this next hour, and I think it'll be a really great conversation. Just want to give a few housekeeping items. For journalists, please identify yourself in the chat when you are in which media outlets you attend to or freelance for, and when you're asking your questions in the chat. We will be recording this and can send the recording to you upon request. In addition, just want to make sure you know, we'll be putting the media accreditation link for the pre-summit, pre-food systems summit, which is happening here in Rome on July 26th to the 28th, but you must be accredited. So we'll send that link around for everybody towards the end of our discussion. Let me first start just by giving a brief overview of the summit, kind of where we are, what the summit's about, for those of you that might not know or have heard only recently of the summit. The summit was brought forward by the Rome-based agencies. These are the three food agencies: the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the World Food Program, who initially came up with the concept of and the need for a summit that was focused on not just food, but food systems. And they took the idea to the UN Secretary General, who that same year announced and called for this Food System Summit in 2021. And he really wanted this to be a launching pad for the Decade of Action, to unleash the power of food across all development areas to deliver progress on all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's one aspect that makes this summit really unique. This isn't just about food, and it's also not just about a moment in time like other conferences and summits that have come before. This has been a culmination of a year-long of work, actually, 18 months of work to get us to the point where we are now. We've had governments lead 130 dialogues in 130 countries, rather, dialogues into 130 countries. We've had nearly 1,000 independent dialogues that have been done by civil society, farmers, indigenous peoples, youth. And all of this is feeding into the 5 action track areas, or 5 priority areas of the summit. And we've taken all of the ideas over the course of the year through public forums, through the dialogues, through surveys, through our online summit community. And all of those ideas brought us to the point where we're at now. We have about 2,000 ideas that we have narrowed down through our action track process into 50 solution clusters. And these solution clusters, these potential solutions, will be further looked at in the month leading up to the pre-summit by governments and by civil society and by UN agencies and NGOs to look at what kind of actions do we need to take forward. And those will be announced during the pre-summit 3 days, as the baking of the cake will happen with the summit in September, with the icing on the cake, if you will, where we will have commitments to action from all over the world. And also what makes this a really interesting summit is that not only is it not a moment of time and it's looking towards all 17 SDGs, this has truly been led by civil society organizations, youth and indigenous peoples, who sit in every aspect, every work stream aspect of the summit. And that's who we have here for you today. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Shakuntala Thilsted, who is the Vice Chair of Action Track 4 around livelihoods. She is the Global Lead for Nutrition and Public Health with WorldFish and the 2021 World Food Prize Laureate. So welcome to you. We also have Professor John Welding, who's a food systems champion in our Champions Network and president of the World Obesity Federation. Also joining us today is Laura Mello, country director of Guatemala for the UN World Food Program. It's also the anchoring agency for Action Track 5 on resilience. And we also have Dr. Channing Arndt, Director of Environment and Production Technology Research Division of IFPRI. Dr. Arndt is also a contributor to the Summit's Science Group. So we're very happy to have all of you with us today. Let me just get started by turning it over to Dr. Thilsted for some opening remarks. We'll have some opening remarks from all of our panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions. Dr. Thilsted.
Thank you so much, Katie. And as Katie said, I'm the Vice Chair of Action Track 4 of the Food Systems Summit, which is on advanced equitable livelihoods. And I'm also a champion of the food systems. I was nominated by Dr. Agnes Kalibati. With less than 10 years to achieving the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, we do know that one of the crucial pathways to get us there is food systems transformation for healthy people and our planet. This transformation must occur across food, land, and water systems, and must be based on a holistic systems framework, taking into consideration the ways in which we produce, process, distribute, consume, and even waste our food. And we do know that all these processes are presently threatening the health of both people and our planet. We also know from data that our food systems are not equitable. This inequity cuts across all levels of the food systems, those producing, distributing our food, and all the way to those consuming. Many of these people are women, indigenous peoples, and youth, the groups on which we are focusing on in Action Track 4. And they live in low and middle income countries. They're the first who go hungry, suffer malnutrition, and are the most vulnerable to disruptions. Disruptions such as we see now with the COVID-19 pandemic, climate shocks, and locust infestation in Africa. By putting the dignity of those who produce our food and work within the food systems first, we can change the whole system. We need innovative solutions and strategies that rebalance our food systems, that deliver healthy, sustainable, and equitable food systems for all women, men, and children, no matter where they live. So one of the tagline we have, as you know, is leave no one behind. The UN Food Systems Summit is a solution summit. It is all about changing mindsets, shifting the discourse, and coordinating actions among the different actors to transform the food systems to nourish all people, nations, and our planet. The food systems is also termed a people summit. So it is imperative we leave no one behind, not only listening to the issues that they face and the problems that they face, or the issues that we say are wrong with our food systems and that we have to change, but most importantly, engaging all actors and all players within the game-changing solutions. It is crucial that the voices of women are heard, listened to, and acted upon, and we must include women, indigenous peoples, and youth in developing the solutions, in implementing the solutions, assessing and scaling the solutions, and ensuring that the solutions that we put forward all together meet their needs and aspirations. Policymakers, civil and business leaders must hear the call to shift the narrative from feeding a growing population with a focus perhaps on only a few food items to a focus on nourishing our people with diverse, culturally acceptable foods, and that at the same time protect the health of our planet. My work as the Vice Chair of Action Track 4, and I work alongside our Chair, Michelle Nunn, who is in charge of care, and many others engaged in the Action Track 4 and across all of the 5 action tracks. We are working to identify game-changing solutions. You heard Katie say that we are up to over 2,000 solutions from many different groups, and to ensure that the food systems create jobs to eliminate poverty, raise incomes across the food supply chains, reduce the risk of the most marginalized, and increase equitable food and consumption. Again, it is important in Action Track 4, which is the action track that is people-centered, that we put the dignity of those who work in food systems first, and through that have an impact throughout the whole food system and across all action tracks. Let me end by saying that going forward, this is just the beginning. And we do know that we have 10 years to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, but we have to even think about going beyond for the sustainability of a planet. And this summit therefore pushes the limits and commitments and actions of every one of us to be an agent of change, a food systems champion for strong, resilient, equitable, and sustainable food systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thilsted. That was very well put, and a very strong and powerful ending that we won't forget. Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Professor Wilding.
Thank you very much, Katie. So yes, so I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, being a clinician and chair of the World Obesity, president of the World Obesity Federation. I think we mostly all recognize that obesity rates are increasing pretty much everywhere in the world. And in fact, the impact of that, the adverse impact of that on health is going to be felt much more in lower middle income countries than it is in high income countries. And those severe consequences, I think many people recognize. Conditions like diabetes are rising rapidly, and that leads to associated heart disease. We also know that obesity and some of the diets that are associated with obesity are also associated with an increased risk of cancer. And we've also seen in the last 15 months or so, the COVID-19 pandemic affecting people living with obesity to a greater extent than people without obesity. So this even influences infectious disease. And some of the work that we've done in World Obesity Federation has highlighted, firstly, the fact that people with obesity are more likely to end up in intensive care and die from COVID-19, and that countries with high rates of obesity have higher mortality from COVID-19. So I think I recognize that a lot of the work in this summit is focusing on malnutrition, but we have to remember that malnutrition doesn't just include undernutrition, it's malnutrition in all its forms. And many of the people that we see with obesity across the world have a diet that is rich in calories, but low in quality. And I think it's going to be very important. And I can see so many potential positive impacts coming from this that are going to help us in the fight against obesity. We recognized some work that we did with the Lancet Commission a few years ago, that obesity, malnutrition and climate change are all linked. And if we're going to make a difference to this really important clinical problem, we're going to have to address all of these together. And that means a systems-based approach. There isn't a simple answer to this. Part of it is related to ultra-processed food, high energy density food. We know this from clinical studies as well as from epidemiological studies. And so actually shifting to a more sustainable, perhaps more locally produced, more wholesome diet is likely to be good for people's health, and particularly likely to help us with obesity. But the strategies aren't just going to be around that. They're going to include educational strategies. Maybe governments are going to have to think about how they limit or control the marketing of some of the unhealthier foods. And these policies have been tested or are being tested in some countries, including in the UK. Taxation is another fiscal approach that might help. And we also have to think about public procurement. Many of us work in the public sector, and some of the food that is provided for us through government departments, of course, could probably be healthier than it is at the moment. And so overall, I think if we're going to help tackle the problem of obesity, there is a huge alignment with the work that is being done in relation to this summit and the outcomes of this summit. And I think if we can get locally produced, more sustainable food, it's much more likely to be healthy for the population. And I think it will reduce the pressure to increase obesity in the population, as well as reducing many of the related complications that I've already mentioned. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Professor Wilding. And I think it's a really important point and a reminder that, COVID has exposed deficiencies, nay, failures of our food systems. And it's not just impacting the least developing countries, it's globally. 1 in 6 Americans are now going to bed hungry because of the COVID pandemic. And so I think it's really important to note that when we talk about transforming our food systems, it's in every single country that it needs to happen. So thank you for that. Our next speaker is Laura Mello, the country director for Guatemala for the World Food Program. Laura.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm going to talk to you very much taking the specific case of Guatemala, because I think it's one of these countries that not only resonates a lot with what my 2 previous speakers have mentioned, but that is really a good example of the relevance of working on food systems as a sustainable and long-term solution from so many of the problems. If we consider that Guatemala is a high mid-income country, but at the same time is a country where about almost 50% of children suffer from chronic malnutrition, where there is clearly a problem of not the double, but the triple burden of malnutrition, whereby chronic malnutrition cohabitates exactly with obesity, with lack of micronutrients. So this all is compounded in terms of the situation that we have in the country. And on top of that, it's a country that is extremely vulnerable to climatic shocks that severely impact food security and nutrition. So the process that has been undertaken by this summit, the Food Systems Summit, is indeed extremely relevant for a country such as Guatemala, given the circumstances that I've mentioned. And the process in Guatemala has taken off. There's been a wide process of consultation, of dialogues, both led by the government as well as independent dialogues. Right now, I think about 240 people have participated from different sectors and different stakeholders, a very prevalent participation of women in the process, representing different territories in the country. And what is really interesting from the consultations that we are doing, or the country has been doing, is to realize that one of the most, considering how vulnerable the country is to climate change, is that this is precisely one of the key factors of vulnerability for the food systems in the country. So the lack of access to livelihoods, to water, to soil, the lack of application and use of sustainable agricultural practices by small and medium farmers and producers is really one of the key issues in the vulnerability that there are in the food systems, and that then result in limited access of food for many people, and in a way that is equitable, that is healthy, and hence the whole issue of nutrition, that it's so relevant for Guatemala, and also an access to food that is culturally relevant for the population. Also, it's extremely important, and these are some of the topics that have already been indeed identified through this process of consultation, the need to increase the production of healthy food. And I think this is very, very relevant for Dr. John Wilding and the work that he's doing as well, this whole issue of health and the consumption of safe and nutritious food. And also the application of technology in terms of food production and processing that makes food efficiency, that contributes to this holistic process, on this holistic focus on food systems that address production chains, that improve social protection, that also contribute to building resilience. And indeed, the impact of COVID again has been extremely powerful and damaging for the food security of the Guatemalan population. So involving contributing to social protection, building the resilience of the systems, and really considering also what is the necessary public spending and investment to have these food systems that are sustainable. So some of the key issues that have been identified through the consultation process, we look at the strengthening of post-harvest management, food storage systems at community level, the design and development of early warning systems that reduce the risks for populations that are vulnerable to seasonal hunger. Guatemala is still a country that every year there is the so-called hunger period, where the number of people who are food insecure, where the number of children that are acute malnourished also increase. So there is really the need to have early warning and preventive measures, the strengthening of public policies to guarantee the production and storage of basic grains, the need to really have effective social protection programs that focus on the socio-economic context and that address that socio-economic context. Issues of gender extremely important, as we have already mentioned in the course of this panel, because indeed, and Guatemala is no exception, the women, and particularly in the case of Guatemala, indigenous women are really at the bottom of the pile. They are the most vulnerable to food insecurity, to malnutrition, and so the importance of taking and focus on women is extremely important in terms of building resilience. So if we look at what WFP is proposing and what we are really looking at, one of the issues that also we are extremely preoccupied, and taking again the chair that I'm sitting on in Guatemala, the increase in hunger is also, and our lack perhaps of ability to respond to this situation, it's also leading people to migrate because of climate change, migrate because of hunger that results from climate change, results from COVID, results from chronic poverty in a country. So it's extremely important really to rethink what we need to do to achieve food systems that really address food security in nutrition, also in a way to address this issue of migration that is being a major problem, and that really compromises the social and community tissue of so many areas in countries like Guatemala. So we need to look at using social protection programs that are food sensitive, that are nutrition sensitive, to really promote local actions that link the solutions that we are proposing at national level, also at local level, and that are culturally relevant for the communities that are more relevant. We also need to look at social protection systems that are shock responsive, because so many countries have these recurrent shocks, and I think, again, Guatemala is a good example because there are droughts, there is hurricanes, there is earthquakes, there is volcanoes that really affect the sustainability of the food system. So we need to have shock responsive social protection systems that allow us to give immediate responses while we are also working to build resilience at a local level, and also with a focus on immediate term as well as medium and longer term. And I think it's extremely important to look at what is the capacity that governments have, again, at local level as well as at national level. We find also that school
sorry
feeding
to interrupt you, but we're a little short of time, so I just want to make sure that we're staying on time. So would it be possible for you to wrap up your opening remarks in 1 minute?
Sure. So I think really the key message is the need to look at both community level as well at national level, and to look at both immediate responses as well as resilience building responses in areas of great vulnerability.
Thank you, and apologies for the interruption. I want to say I really appreciate the point that you made around Indigenous peoples. In particular, Guatemala is a particular case. There's more than 20 Indigenous peoples groups in Guatemala. And so this is a really important issue also for the Food System Summit to be looking at ensuring that what solutions are being put forward are in a local context, but rightly so, as you say, also a cultural context. Which is really important. So with that, turn it over, Dr. Arndt, for some opening remarks from you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Katie. So the food system faces huge interlocking challenges, and we've heard about some of these already. So Shakuntala is talking about, in a way, the food system as the world's largest employer, and the inequities that are present in that system, and the dependence of many poor people on the food system for jobs and for their livelihoods and welfare. John referred to the obesity crisis, which, as he said, was growing everywhere. Laura spoke about the case of Guatemala and many things that are happening there, but I'll highlight the resilience and shocks issue. And she was also highlighting how these things interface. To that, you could look globally at greater demand for food, particularly in poor countries where population is growing and incomes are growing. We can look at the desire, which we look at IFPRI, for much reduced environmental damage of all sorts, emissions, runoff, all of these issues. And then we have the food system is not only a source of greenhouse gas emissions right now, and a major one, but it's a potential sink. And we want to tap that potential to reduce climate change. And meanwhile, we're going to have to do all of these things in a context of climate change. So we expect, for example, some of these shocks to become more pronounced. The heat wave in the Pacific Northwest being just one example. And of course, science and evidence are going to be critical to meeting these challenges. So that's a first point. A second point that I was asked to address was, why do research into policies? That's where I'm with the International Food Policy Research Institute, and that's what we do. There's a lot that we do, but I'll take an innovation policy interface, what's going on with interface, that perspective. So let's take the renewable energy revolution that's happening right now. I just sent a brief this morning to COP26 that shows that in South Africa, we think that the least cost policy, sort of no environmental constraints, no nothing, is to get renewables as about 70% of generation by 2050. So this is a consequence of the really low cost of wind and particularly solar power. Solar power is modular. It can go almost anywhere. We can now drop, relatively efficient electricity almost anywhere into Africa. And so we have huge potentials for rural electrification, but these potentials won't be happening all by themselves. If you go to a community that doesn't have any electricity, that means they don't have anything that runs on electricity. So just dropping a mini grid there doesn't necessarily do things. And like everywhere in the world, rural communities do need policies and specific investments to bring into place the rural electrification. That's going to be part of getting to the healthier diets that John is speaking about, the resilience Vora is speaking about. And if done right, that small-scale irrigation can help the equity issues for women that Shakuntala was speaking about. That's one real challenge. A second one that's going to come about with renewable energy is we know, the renewable energy comes when the wind blows and the sun shines. And it used to be that hydropower was sort of the least marginal cost source of power. And it's not going to be anymore. And in major river basins, the Zambezi, the Indus, the Nile, the Mekong, that we expect and we hope for a substantial contribution of variable renewable energy. And what's going to happen is there's going to be pressure on these rivers and river basins to accommodate that variability by turning on and turning off turbines to generate electricity when demand is high, but not necessarily when demand is low. This has implications for irrigation. That flow will change. And this is a big policy issue that also needs to be studied. Second area where that's obvious is in biotechnology and bioinnovation. We've had with genetic GMOs, a very heated debate about the use of these particular technologies, and the regulatory frameworks are a real constraint in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world. That's a policy issue that needs to be dealt with. We're looking at now with the new breeding technologies, CRISPR-Cas, the recent prizes that have been given, a whole series of new technologies that also allow us to directly go after many of these nutrition, resilience issues, and also the equity issues in terms of bringing technology to farmers. And policies are going to be important to make sure that these new technologies are available to small farmers. And there's a lot of cause to be optimistic that the MBT case will be different from the GMOs. I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I think my 5 minutes are up, Katie, so back to you.
So, thanks so much, Channing. And what's really interesting about all of the opening remarks that I've been really interested, even as I sit in the middle of this process, is that food systems covers everything. Displaced people, as Laura talked about, Dr. Thilsted talked about livelihoods and poverty, gender empowerment. Dr. Wilding, Professor Wilding, excuse me, talked about obesity and nutrition, which might seem obvious, but what you talked about in terms of how the COVID has impacted our nutrition and our health is really important. And then Channing, wrapping up, bringing in energy. I mean, so this is really what this Food Systems Summit is about, is cutting across progress towards all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it cuts across things like energy, our clean oceans, aquatic foods, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really fascinating. And I want to, because of time, I want to just jump right into it and have a question here from our journalist, Thin Nguyen, for Dr. Thilsted. She mentions that there's some organizations planning, parallel summits or events, feeling their concerns might not be fully represented at the summit or during the summit process. Perhaps you can talk about, in your work in the action tracks, how you've brought really strongly into the mix the civil society, indigenous peoples, producers, ensuring that their voices are heard.
Thanks, Katie. And well, in a way, I consider if I would talk about me personally and my roles within the Food Systems Summit, and also with the work I do at WorldFish and with the CGIAR, I consider myself extremely lucky in that the groups that I meet with are different levels, and it's within country. It's both nationally and regionally. So we will work, and we will work with governments, with the private sector, with NGOs, and with people's associations. And in putting dialogues together, we have worked together with all groups, where there are national dialogues, independent dialogues, people's dialogues, and we've worked across the globe with very many different groups in putting the dialogues together. Just a few days ago, I did one with the government of Trinidad and Tobago and a week ago, one in the Solomon Islands with Women's Association. So it's extremely different. However, I do think there are some issues and practical issues that we should take into consideration. One thing is having the voices come together and the voices express their views and also give their solutions. But if we do not get these voices to the top of the decision makers within the food systems, then that's a missed opportunity. And I see one of the bottlenecks being language. And we have the means now to use modern technologies to try to overcome the language barrier, to try to use. We're using a lot of media, a lot of videos, and to get the voices heard. And that I really do hope that we are having issues with the pre-summit to get people together in person, but I do hope that when we get to September, we'll be able to bring not just the voices, but the people to the summit, and that in going forward, that we look towards the commitments that are being made and the investments that we are being made, and we make sure that the voices, the agency, and the aspirations of the people reach to those commitments and investments. Thank you.
Many thanks. And in fact, many of the solutions were brought forward by civil society organizations working. I think there's more than 1/3 of the members that make up the action track teams are civil society. So, but you're absolutely right. We need to make sure it's not just about hearing passive voices, but that we're absolutely taking those actions forward. And I think it's going to be an exciting couple of months in order to accomplish that. Just a question here from, sorry, pulling up my notes, from Chris Clayton from the Progressive Farmer. This one is, I think, for you, Channing, as you mentioned, biotech. Trump administration to the FAO had criticisms over the UN Food System Summit and the view of biotechnology. What is a good point of biotechnology? How can it be utilized? And how is it harmful? So both sides of the coin there.
Okay, it's a very good question. Biotechnology is a really broad area and different things. So we have, for example, recently completed, IFPRI did a study looking at brinjal or eggplant in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, brinjal is a staple food. They eat a lot of it. And it's also an enormous user of pesticides. And there was a variety, a BT variety of brinjal that was produced, that generated with the actually Indian National Agricultural Research Service, and we were able to get, Bangladesh permitted the application of that, or the planting of that variety, which allows us to look at it on farmers' fields and what it does when you're planting one versus the other. So you can do a randomized controlled trial. And what you find is that this brinjal turned out to be better in almost every way. It requires less pesticide, costs less, it yields more, it has fewer infestations. The farmers are healthier, they make more money. It goes on and on. So in these specific cases, and this is all relevant for small farmers, it's not just big farmers, this looked to be a very substantial win with very few downsides. I think what we're starting to see now in the developing world is we're starting to see more application of these technologies. We have some promising advances in places like Nigeria. So Nigeria just recently approved bean cowpea for genetically modified bean cowpea for planting in Nigeria, and this is useful in the sense because it allows us to actually go out in the field and do field trials similar to what we've done with brinjal and see what it's done. The Nigeria decision is significant because it's the first food crop to be approved outside of South Africa on the whole African continent. And Africa is absolutely critical. This is where the big interlocking challenges, where the the production drive actually and the consumption growth is going to be the greatest. So if we look forward, huge increases in total food demand, and almost half of that from Africa because of the combination of population and income growth. And these are some of the tools that we're going to need. We don't want to be just spraying genetically modified stuff around randomly. So we, fully what we do at IFPRI is work with regulatory agencies on policies, on reasonable regulatory frameworks and adequate science that's required to make sure these things are safe. That's obviously important and can be done reasonably efficiently, especially if they're done on a regional basis. So, if Nigeria has done this, then perhaps neighboring countries can build off of their experience. So thanks.
Thank you for that. I think you managed to capture both sides of that issue, for the good and the better. So thank you. Next question we have is for you, Professor Wilding, from Ben Balua, excuse me, from the Island Sun newspaper in the Solomon Islands, where Dr. Thilsted, you just were. There are a lot of uncertified products on the market. How can responsible authorities address this issue, especially in terms of obesity and nutrition? How do we get these products certified?
I presume that the question relates to food products that are being marketed for weight loss.
I'm assuming that as well.
Properties rather than pharmaceuticals. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really difficult. It's a very interesting area because, of course, we know that all of our systems that control our food intake are dependent upon the type of food that we eat, and so we know that in a very energy dense diet we tend to consume more of that if we study it in a controlled environment, and if we look at a diet that is less dense in energy, has more fiber, more whole foods, will tend to make us feel fuller with less calories, and that's kind of the fundamental difference really of why a lot of ultra processed foods tend to lead towards obesity. And of course somebody will see an opportunity in that, so they will then develop a product that is probably quite healthy, but then they start perhaps making claims that are difficult to substantiate without a randomized controlled trial, and most of those trials for food products have not been done. So I think that requires regulatory authorities to look at the way these products are marketed, and most of them are food products, and there's probably nothing wrong with them in terms of general health. They're not going to cause harm, but if they're being promoted in a way that is not supported by the evidence, then that is wrong. And certainly in the UK, we have a very robust regulatory system that would prevent that from happening in most of the time. But I think that is not the case across the world. And I think this is going to have to be something that is considered and looked at. But again, that's down to government policy, and it's also around how strict the regulatory environment is around advertising and marketing. And certainly, I'm aware that is not as strict in many countries as it is in somewhere like the UK and probably Europe and the US as well. But once you start moving into low and middle income countries, I think it's definitely more challenging.
Yeah.
I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Sorry, I think you did the best with the question that we had, and in terms of, and it also brings back what Channing was mentioning before about the regulatory process, even for biotech. I mean, and how these policies need to be really strengthened in certain countries, and I think that's really an ultimate goal for the summit, to bring up these more uncomfortable conversations and have the difficult discussion, and come to the governments to ensure that it's not just the health ministries or the education ministries, it's all of them working together on these processes. It can't just sit in one siloed area. So I think it's an important point. Laura, a question for you in the follow-up of Guatemala and the impact of the pandemic. What is the plan for in that country to kind of build back better? And how can a systems approach really help bring that forward?
I think that we cannot, I mean, the bring back, build back better. I think we have to recognize on one hand the needs, the realizing that the needs, immediate needs of so many people. So I think there is really the necessity to combine on one hand what are almost like a humanitarian response to avoid that people really fall into a situation that would be so dramatic that that could lead to starvation, but also really to look at innovation, look at technology, look at new opportunities to really build the resilience of communities so that they can really look forward. And when we, something that I mentioned in my introduction is also this linkage between hunger, climate impact, and migration. And this is a terrible problem that we are facing in this region. So I think also giving the opportunities for people to invest in their communities, to look forward, to empower women economically. For example, WFP is working on a microinsurance as a resilience product. So and it's not only for farmers, it's for producers, could be women who are producing artifacts, so that we have a different kind of tools for people that when they face a shock of whatever shock, could be a pandemic, could be a drought, could be a flood, that they have the capacity to reinvest in their own community, reinvest in their own livelihoods, and move forward, as opposed to see their livelihoods destroyed and look for drastic solutions for their situation.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I missed where my mute button was. Just a reminder for journalists who are joining us, please ensure that you're putting your questions in the chat and identify the media outlet that you are working for, or many of the media outlets you might be working for if you're a freelancer. Thanks so much. Dr. Thilsted, there's quite a lengthy question that has come in. If you give me just a second, I'll read it out here. How long can we survive with traditional food generating systems, farming, irrigation, with such a high water footprint? River water is getting polluted, and then there's also the challenge of water scarcity. How important is modern farming foods that require less water to grow?
Thanks, Katie. Maybe I'll give an answer that's not direct to the question, but give some reflections on that question. So first of all, if you take where we are now with the food systems, and what we have been doing and focusing on, we have had the focus on food and land systems. And when we've talked about water, we've talked about water in terms of irrigation, and in terms of making land systems more productive. When we talk about food systems, I think one of the first things that we must consider about water is, if you will look at national food-based dietary guidelines for not for feeding, but for nourishing populations, the first recommendation is on safe water, drinking water. And we haven't talked, when we talk about food systems, I haven't heard very much mention about food as part of water as part of dietary guidelines. The second point I want to make again with water, yes, we are seeing water shortages. We are seeing changes in water. However, our management systems, and it was, I think one of our panelists talked about that, about the river flows, for example, in the Mekong, and the way the flows of waters are managed, and the changes that are happening with the flows of water for many different purposes. So governments, taking into consideration the needs of their populations, must be able to put in place the solutions and the policies that that meet the needs of their people. And if it's water flows for wetlands, that's one thing. And if it's water flows for irrigation, another, or for power sources, it's another. But that's where we must have responsible governments that take into consideration the needs of their population. The third point I want to make is that in where we are with our food systems, it has been a lot about, as we've heard also from Janet, it has been a lot about feeding. And we need to make this shift from feeding to nourishing. And the fundamental difference in that shift is diversity of production systems, diversity of foods on the plate. And Shannon gave the example of brinjal. When I look at brinjal from consumption surveys. And if I would look at the many, many different varieties of brinjals, and the way they're being used in traditional diets, the way you value culture, size, taste, and the very many different recipes and diets and foods that you make with brinjal, we shouldn't lose that diversity. Diversity is fundamental for nourishing, and it's fundamental for sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And just a kind of a quick follow-up, Dr. Arden, I saw you kind of nodding your hand. So about diversity in the context of food system, how important also is agroecology to this?
So agroecology is a really interesting and big push, obviously, within the Food Systems Summit, right? And nature positive production is another way of looking at it. And there's just a lot to say here. I think one of the most interesting and promising routes forward in terms of looking forward with food systems are these landscape perspectives that are becoming much more in line. And this is not a completely new idea by any means, but we're now really able to look at landscapes in a much more systematic way and think about, okay, how do landscapes sort of need to be designed in order to get the kind of sort of natural system protection, keep pests down, allow for animals to move, and have a much more nature positive production system in place. And I think we are getting to the point where we can look at that in a more rigorous way with the ways. But it is a really big departure from what we have traditionally done in terms of looking at a whole landscape is quite different from sort of looking at a square meter by square meter and then just adding them up, and which is sort of more or less what we've traditionally done. So I think there's a lot of promise here to bring about the sort of diversity that Shakuntala was talking about, and to have this this agriculture much more fit within the agroecological system in a way that reduces the bads, but keeps the goods that we want.
Thank you. So shifting a little bit here, Professor Wilding, another question for you. Recently, GAIN and WWF have signed an MOU, and this has been kind of under the work of the summit umbrella. What other kind of opportunities are you seeing from your point of view for unexpected alliances or partnerships as we elevate the discourse around food systems?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Obviously, from the World Obesity Federation perspective, a lot of the work we do is around clinical alliances, but of course, food is so fundamental to so many of the diseases that are related to obesity, diabetes, cancer, etc. I do think that we certainly see potential for alliances. For example, activating youth, there's a strong activation of youth around climate change. And I think actually getting youth to recognize that developing sustainable, healthy, locally based food systems is likely to result in a healthier population and at the same time contribute towards reducing global heating is going to be a good thing. So I think those sorts of alliances are ones that are perhaps not obvious from the outside, but ones that we would see as being potentially very, very important.
Really, really good point. And if I may quote my boss, the special envoy, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, she says, you know, we need a youth movement in food systems equal to what we've had and seen around climate change. And let's hope that we, with this pre-summit and the summit process, we can make some noise and get them energized and moving. And it's certainly another kind of unique aspect of this summit is that youth leaders are across all of the priority areas. They are leading our champions network, and they in our advisory committee. So I think that's kind of a key learning that's come out of the Climate Action Summit is that youth are absolutely central to this process. So I think it's an important point. I'm just conscious of time, so if I can just do a quick rapid fire last kind of a question for our panelists, and let me pull that up. So very rapid fire. What would success from the summit look like for you and for your agenda? Dr. Thilsted, starting with you. Putting you on the spot.
Thank you, Katie. For me, and I guess it depends on what kind of background you have and where in the world you spend your time or live. So for me, I'd like to see very strong commitments from governments and with respect to policies and policies that take into consideration the voices of the people. At the same time, I would like to see much more investments in research, on data, and on having a focus on diverse foods on the plate, the complementarity of these diverse foods, and using the consumption to shift the agenda all the way back to production, and not as we have done in the past, start with production and move to consumption. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, over to you. Guatemala and beyond borders.
Well, I think the word commitment seems to be the kind of the common trend. I think it's really a strong commitment from the government, from the communities, to actually give voice, but not only to give voice, to actually act upon the interests and the benefits of the most vulnerable, those who are at the bottom of the pyramid. I mentioned women, I mentioned indigenous women, I mentioned youth, to give them an opportunity for their communities to grow, for them to believe in their future, believe in being able to stay where they are, construct a life and project themselves ahead, thinking that they will have an opportunity to feed themselves, feed their families, and actually develop economically and bring development to their countries as well.
Thank you. And just if I can add one more point that you brought up before, displaced people. Which is really central also to this summit, which people don't realize, but you know, the special envoy who's leading this summit spent the first 30 years of her life as a refugee in Uganda. So she, and it's because her father had a small piece of land that she was able to, her family was able to afford to send her to school, and changed the trajectory of her life. So I think let's not forget about those, the most marginalized, but also those displaced people who have other needs. Professor Wilding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is going to come down to this strength of action from governments. But I do think that, and I haven't sort of talked about this very much, but I do think that regulatory framework has to include the sort of big food industries and the big vested interests in there that are probably the toughest nut to crack, if you like. Because if we're going to end up with, you know, a sustainable food system, those people have got to be on board, and we've got to try and, you know, limit the marketing of the unhealthy stuff to large numbers of the population, which is happening across the world, not just in the developing world, it's happening everywhere.
Thank you. And again, a good point that this is about transforming food systems globally and in all communities in all areas around the world. Dr. Arndt, final
Yeah,
word from you.
I'll echo Shakuntala and John in terms of the importance of governments and well-informed governments who are able to use the evidence. So they listen to their people, but they'll also have the evidence, the evidence base, such that they're able to act on that advice in a way that's going to improve the lives of people, and especially the poorest. I think the UNFSS could do a really good job of getting this food systems perspective across these interlinked challenges. That's very important. And I do think that this well-informed basis is extremely important, and that we do need, as we head to, what is really, as Shakuntala was saying, a transformation of food, land, and water systems that is quite unprecedented. We need the research to be able to execute that transformation in the way that we want to have happen. And this includes the human dimensions, obesity, and other elements as well. I don't want to drop this. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all. This has been a really rich discussion and really diverse, which has pleased me greatly, seeing all the different areas of when we talk about food system transformation come together. Just a quick reminder for the journalist, if you want to join the pre-summit 26th to the 28th of July, you must accredit. The link is in the chat for you. We're happy to provide the recording to you. As well as any follow-up information and follow-up interviews with our panelists or our other experts across our Champions and Action Track membership. Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate this. And 4 weeks, 3.5 weeks to go and pre-summit kickoff. So let's see if we can make it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie, for moderating.
Sure, yes.
Thank you so much.
I did not do as good
Thank
as
you for the
Dr. Fritz
opportunity.
right now.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.